When we think of the Soviet Union, we think of red flags, nuclear missiles, long bread lines, and cold gray cities. A superpower locked in an ideological battle with the West. But how did it all actually work? Not just the propaganda or the high-level politics, but the gears, the inner workings, the day-to-day reality of the system. Let's start from the beginning. The Soviet Union was born in the ashes of Imperial Russia. In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed, and a group of radical Marxist revolutionaries called the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized control. Their mission was to build a new kind of state, a workers' paradise where capitalism would be abolished, the people would own everything collectively, and a single party would guide the revolution to its final destination: communism. To get there, they needed to take control, absolute control. The Soviet Union was officially formed in 1922, uniting multiple republics under one centralized system. On paper, it was a federation, each republic with its own government and supposed autonomy. In reality, everything was run from Moscow. The Communist Party was the beating heart of the system. It wasn't just a political group, it was the system. If you weren't in the party, you had no real influence. The party appointed the leaders, set the goals, controlled the military, oversaw education, ran the factories, and even dictated what music you listened to and what art you could create. At the top of this hierarchy was the General Secretary of the Communist Party, the true leader of the Soviet Union. Not a president, not a king, but functionally more powerful than either. Stalin, for example, ruled not just through policy, but through fear, purges, and personality cults. His face was everywhere. His words were law. Under him, the Soviet state became a terrifying and efficient machine. The core of that machine was the command economy. In capitalist economies, prices and production are decided by supply and demand. But in the Soviet Union, the government decided everything. Central planners in Moscow would set production targets: how much steel to make, how many tractors to build, how much wheat to harvest. These goals were laid out in rigid, ambitious 5-year plans, and factories, farms, and workers were expected to meet them. On paper, this seemed like a way to eliminate waste and inequality. In practice, it created its own chaos. Because meeting quotas mattered more than actual results, reports were often faked. Factories would turn out unusable products just to meet numbers. Farmers might slaughter livestock early to meet meat production targets, only to cause shortages later. And while heavy industry grew rapidly, steel, coal, and weapons, basic goods like shoes, toothpaste, or fresh fruit were often hard to find. That's where the infamous breadlines came from. Even if you had money, there often wasn't much to buy. People lined up for hours, not knowing what would be left on the shelves. Stores were run by the state, prices were fixed, and choices were limited. But there was another side to it too. Education was free. Healthcare was universal. Childcare, housing, even vacations at state resorts, these were all provided by the government. In fact, for many Soviet citizens, especially in the early years, this system brought stability. Illiteracy plummeted. Women entered the workforce in huge numbers. Science and engineering were heavily funded. And for a time, the Soviet Union looked like it might genuinely be able to compete with the West. So how did daily life work? Most people lived in modest apartments called Khrushchevkas, named after Nikita Khrushchev. These were small, identical buildings built quickly to house the growing urban population. Apartments were assigned by the government based on need and availability. You didn't buy them, you were given one, and you might live in the same unit for your entire life. Jobs were also assigned. You didn't pick your career based on a job market or company offers. Instead, after university or military service, you were often placed where the state needed you. Whether it was as an engineer in a factory, a teacher in a rural village, or a doctor in a city clinic, your job was both a duty and a privilege. It gave you status, food coupons, and sometimes access to better housing. But choice was limited. Travel outside the country was nearly impossible unless you were a trusted official or athlete. Internal travel required permits. Religion was discouraged and often suppressed, and any kind of political dissent could get you arrested or worse. The secret police were everywhere. Known at different times as the Cheka, NKVD, and eventually the KGB, they monitored citizens closely. Your neighbor could be an informant. A joke about the wrong leader could land you in a labor camp. Entire families disappeared during the Stalinist purges. Fear wasn't just a side effect, it was a tool of control. Meanwhile, the military and space programs became symbols of national pride. The Soviet Union poured enormous resources into developing weapons, tanks, submarines, and eventually nuclear missiles. The arms race with the United States defined much of the 20th century, with both sides stockpiling enough firepower to destroy the world many times over. But it wasn't all about war. The Soviets also launched the first satellite, Sputnik, and the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin. These achievements weren't just about science. They were propaganda victories, proof that communism could deliver results. Still, cracks began to show. By the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet economy was stagnating. The centralized system that once allowed rapid growth now became a bureaucratic nightmare. Innovation slowed. Corruption grew. Workers had no incentive to work harder because wages were fixed and promotions were political. People joked, "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us." Underground black markets began to grow as citizens found ways to get what the state couldn't provide: jeans, Western music, foreign movies, even chewing gum. Discontent simmered, especially among the younger generation, who were increasingly aware of life outside the USSR. In response, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and introduced reforms. Glasnost, meaning openness, allowed for more freedom of speech and press. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, tried to reform the economy by introducing limited market mechanisms. But it was too little, too late. The reforms destabilized the old system, but didn't fix the economy. Nationalist movements gained strength in the republics. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, demanded independence. Eastern Europe, once firmly under Soviet control, began to slip away. Then, in 1991, it all fell apart. A failed coup by hardline communists revealed just how weak the center had become. Republic after republic declared independence, and by the end of the year, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So how did the Soviet Union function? It functioned through centralized control, a powerful one-party state, and a belief, at least at first, that socialism could deliver a better world. It relied on planning, not profit. Discipline, not debate, but it also depended on fear, censorship, and sacrifice. It created world-class scientists, artists, and athletes, but also silenced dissenters, jailed poets, and crushed uprisings. It lifted millions from poverty, but also limited freedom in nearly every aspect of life. It was a contradiction, both a dream and a warning. A system that promised utopia but struggled with the very nature of power. Today, the legacy of the Soviet Union is still visible in Russia, in former republics, and in the way we think about government, freedom, and ideology. Understanding how it worked helps us understand not just the past, but the forces that continue to shape the world today. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, consider subscribing for more deep dives into history, politics, and the systems that shape our world. And let us know in the comments what surprised you most about how the Soviet Union really functioned.